We're happy that you're here. This is the webinar on setting the learning table brain science approaches to deeper learning with Dr. Rachel Onello. So I would like to introduce Dr. Onello, and she is a associate professor at the University of South Carolina College of Nursing, and she's done a lot of designing and implementing simulation-based education, as well as teaching online classroom and clinical learning environments, and integrating evidence-based neuroscience principles in the pedagogy of teaching and learning. So we are extremely happy that she's here. We're looking forward to this presentation. There will be breakout sessions later in the session, and I will be assigning all of you to those. You don't have to do anything yourself, and Dr. Onello will be telling you what you will be doing in those, but not yet. I will go ahead and let Dr. Onello take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. It's exciting to see everyone here. I presented a version of this session at the Oktoberfest in the fall, so I was thrilled and honored to be invited back by the CTE to do a deeper dive on this topic. And so I'm recognizing a few names that I saw at our last session. So just so you know, you'll get a fresh and new taste of this and a little bit dipping your toes deeper in the water, so to speak. And for those who are new to this, I just kind of want to frame up this idea of brain science. This may be a new concept or a new terminology for some, and brain science is really this combination of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, understanding how the brain is wired on a neuronal level of how we store information, how we make meaning of it, how we learn. And so how do we leverage that as educators to really improve the learning process for our students? So we're going to dive into that a little bit today. So with that, by the end of the session, I hope you're able to walk away with some ideas and some strategies for incorporating brain science principles into development of learning resources within your own discipline. And just to frame this up and manage expectations from the beginning, we could talk for weeks on metacognition and brain science-based teaching. In fact, I've done it with some colleagues at other institutions for over 10 weeks over a summer course. So we really truly are just dipping our toes into this. And so I hope that it may stimulate some interest, pique your curiosity to dive deeper. And I have limited resources listed on the last slide, but if you're interested in learning more, I have, it's going on now 8 pages of just citations of neuroscience research for those who may be interested in and get you started in learning more. So with that, I say we get started. I want to toss it out first to you all to give some thought to the question on the screen and type your responses in the chat box about what are some of the challenges you experience with how students study outside of class times. So I'm seeing from Sue's reading and rereading, inefficient use of study time, procrastination, cramming, reading and memorizing. Either they don't study outside of class time or they cram, a lack of active reading. I'm seeing a lot of the same theme. They don't study, right? They don't use time outside of class to study. Thinking that reading is the best way. Absolutely. They don't really know what studying is. Yes, we're going to talk about that. I appreciate that comment. They think if they can go through the steps to repeat a problem, they're all set for the exam. Absolutely. Reviewing PowerPoints. Yes. Lack of time management, so they cram. Yes, we're all experiencing the same phenomenon regardless of our discipline. And so I want us to take a moment to look at the literature to see what does the literature say that our challenges students are experiencing with study strategies. And it's a lot of what you all are experiencing in the trenches. Yes, all the above. So one of the first things, and this is, again, not exhaustive, but the things that rise to the top when we look at the literature is what many of you have said. They don't read or they don't study. And for those who do read, they read inefficiently. They think that reading requires using their textbook from the first page to the last page, or they don't know how to use their textbook. And so when they're faced with a full course load of assignments and courses that total hundreds of pages of reading at a time, they don't know how to navigate that. And so they tend to not do it. Another strategy that we'll see, or another challenge, is that they lack the skills to know how to study. And we saw this popping up in the chat box from several people. So just like this gentleman here who's using the end of a power drill to try to nail in or hammer in a nail into the wall, our students tend to resort to study strategies that undermine their learning. And so they will engage in things like highlighter painting, or just using the PowerPoints, or printing out the PowerPoint in outline form, and that's all they do. And it creates what brain science calls the fluency illusion, or the illusion of competency, that in the moment it feels good and it feels like it's working, and then they come to the exam and they realize they don't know what they thought that they knew. And so the challenge with this is that the appropriate or effective study strategies that really emphasize synthesis and analysis and metacognition are neither innate nor are they natural feeling for students. And so we need to help students learn how to engage in some of those behaviors. And then the final kind of bucket of challenges students encounter, according to the literature, is that they don't tend to see the big picture, and they may see pieces or siloed approaches to the content without seeing how the pieces are related. And so it leaves them not realizing the areas in their blind spot that needs further reinforcement. And it also leads to what we see in the literature as that Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know as much, and the less you know, the more you think you know. And so there's a lot of research in neurocognitive psychology that shows that higher mastery students tend to underestimate their knowledge and their confidence, and our lower mastery students tend to overestimate their knowledge and their confidence in their knowledge. So where do we go from that? Well, we have this dilemma that we're sort of faced with as educators, and how do we move our learners from this paradigm of, okay, I'm going to open up my brain and I want you just to pour it all in, this spoon feeding approach, and moving them to being active constructors of their own knowledge. And in doing so, how do we provide resources for them that we're not inadvertently reinforcing this paradigm of spoon feeding, right? So how do we create resources that's going to help them be active constructors of their own knowledge? So to do that, we have to really understand what are some of those fallacies of learning that are at play here. So what are the mistaken beliefs that are really pervasive in our students, that also may be pervasive among our colleagues too? They may not understand really how the brain works to learn. And so here's some of the fallacies of learning that exist in the literature. So this belief that reading and writing verbatim means learning, that mastering the lecture or the text or the words that come out of the faculty's mouth equates to mastering the ideas behind them, that in the idea that in the syntax lies the meaning. Rereading notes over and over again equals studying. Not true. When you ask students how they study, when they say, oh, I just reread the notes or I reread the text, that's actually not studying, but they think that that is studying. Study strategies from previous coursework will work for this coursework. And so this is one of the things that I think will probably resonate with everyone, whether you teach in the undergrad, lower division courses where students are coming in from high school, whether you teach in a core specialty and they're coming from Carolina Core to you, or whether you teach in a graduate program and they're coming from an undergraduate degree. A lot of times students believe the way that they studied in the past is going to work now. And that's not such truth in the literature. We talked a lot, and I'm seeing a lot of messages in the chat box about cramming. And so they really do believe that consolidating learning and blocking is best, when in fact the literature is telling us you need to space out learning. It's called spaced learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a controversial one, so I'm going to acknowledge the elephant in the room. There's emerging research out there right now that shows that perhaps learning styles aren't so pervasive in the effectiveness of learning as we once thought they were. So there is a fallacy that learning styles should exactly match their study approaches. And there's some research out there that shows while we do have a preference for learning, we do feel comfortable either psychomotor learning or a read-write learner or an auditory learner, there's actually no rigorous evidence that decisively supports the idea that if you use or engage in a learning style that's not quite the way that feels comfortable to you, that you're not going to actually learn. So there's more research to come out on that. And here's the big leaguer. I'm a big sports analogy person, and so the big leaguer of all fallacies here is the illusion of fluency, also called the illusion of competency, which is because it feels easy now means it will feel that way later. So I'm going to present a scenario to you and see if this resonates with you. How many times have you had a student either come to you on virtual office hours or face-to-face upset saying, I studied, I studied, I studied. I spent so much time in your course preparing for this exam. I thought I knew it. I felt good. And I sat down on this exam and I just don't know what happened. I felt like I couldn't answer the questions. Has that happened to anybody? I'm seeing a thumbs up, a yes, especially for non-majors. Absolutely. So what they just lived through and what you were witnessing is the illusion of fluency, that they engage in these, I'm going to use air quotes, study habits that really aren't studying. Things like the highlighting. If you ask them to show you their textbook or their notes, it's literally painted in highlighter with every word other than of, that, and, or, right? Or they say that they just print out the outline of the PowerPoint, or they download the textbook study resource and don't do any active creating or elaboration of their own. And so what's happening on a brain science level is it's just cycling through short-term memory while they're doing that. And they think that it feels good. They're able to recognize it, say, yes, I know it, I know it. And then when they sit down at a test and are relying on long-term memory, it was never stored effectively in long-term memory in a way they could retrieve it when they need it. And so that's one of the big challenges we have to work with our students in helping them understand and creating resources that combat that fluency illusion. Yes, I'm seeing Chegg, Gur, yes. All right, so what are some antidotes that we need to be aware of as educators that can help combat this fluency illusion? So one of the first brain science concepts is retrieval practice. It's this opportunity to actively recall information. And what's key here is from memory. So the first step is to get students to buy into this. And then the second step is to help them understand it's got to be from memory. Things like quizzing that they do, or drawing diagrams and tables from memory, constructing concept maps, or teaching someone else. And one of the downfalls we'll see, and just for transparency reasons, I come from a paradigm of nursing and healthcare. We'll ask our students to do concept maps and they'll say, oh, I did it, but I didn't feel like it helped. And I'll ask them, walk me through your process of when you were doing these activities. Well, I laid out my notes, I laid out my textbook, I had everything in front of me, and I was just looking and finding the information and writing it down. That's not from memory. That's actually short-circuiting that productive struggle, that desirable difficulty that we need them to engage in to actively engage in retrieval practice. So it means closing the notes, closing the textbook before they feel they're ready, and really engaging and leaning into that productive struggle of understanding, I'm going to feel like I'm hitting my head against a wall. There's going to be holes in my chart or on my concept map or on my 1-minute brain dump, whatever activity that you have them do. And that's a normal part of the learning process. The other concept that helps fight fluency illusion is a concept called priming in brain science. And priming is really the idea that we're exposing students to the content before we actually teach it to them, before they actually immerse themselves in it. So it may be them doing some questions either outside of class or at the beginning of class on iClicker or Socrative app or whatever technology you use, for questions that content you haven't delivered yet, to prime them and get them in the right headspace. But also, the neuroscience of learning tells us that incorrect guessing on content they haven't actually manipulated yet or immersed themselves in will actually potentiate the learning. It sprinkles the seeds, so to speak. So when they revisit it again later in your class, they're going to get better traction with that vocabulary, that concept, that content that you're trying to get them to learn. And then avoiding the short-circuiting of this productive struggle. Students don't want really to feel that discomfort that's natural for learning. And so really refraining from what I call highlighter painting. I really encourage them to use flashcards judiciously. They need to know when it's appropriate to use flashcards and when it's not. It seems like today the go-to is Quizlet. And I'm not bashing Quizlet. I think cards and flashcards have a place, but I think that that needs to have a very intended purpose. When you're trying to learn vocabulary, trying to do straight recall, trying to commit things to memorization. But a lot of times students don't understand that when you're trying to learn application level, when you're trying to learn critical thinking and judgment skills and learn connections between pieces, Quizlet and flashcards aren't going to cut it for you. And they turn to that as a resource and then sit down on exam and aren't able to put those puzzle pieces together. And then also avoiding the short-circuiting is helping them learn how to self-create study guides and self-create notes rather than pre-developed study guides that either we provide them with all the answers or that they print out from a vendor or a publisher. And then a lot of us have experienced this cramming from our first question, and this gets back to spaced retrieval practice in brain science. It means that students space out their learning over time rather than these marathons of practice. And if we do that and provide those opportunities for learners with feedback, whether that's rationales for questions or giving them feedback on whether their solutions or problems are correct or where the buffing needs to happen to buff them up, helps them with self-calibration. And self-calibration is another term that's important in brain science that helps us understand how do we assess our own knowledge and monitor our performance and make changes and adjustments in our approaches to learning. So I want to do a little unpacking of some of these concepts that I mentioned to you and primed you with, whether you realized you were doing brain science or not, before we talk about in the trenches what this looks like for our learners. So spaced learning, this is for my visual learners, this is a representation of this idea of spaced learning, that we have 3 students, Jordan, Luke, and Sally. And Sally is our typical crammer. She's going to dedicate X amount of hours. And in this situation, we did 4. But I think many of us would argue we've seen students that do 8 or 10 or 12 or an entire weekend, overnight sessions, things like that. And then we have Luke, who spends the same amount of hours in totality, 4 hours, but Luke breaks them up into 1-hour study sessions. And then Jordan spends the same amount of 4 hours, but breaks them up into half-hour sessions. And so you'll see on the right-hand column these letters A, B, and C. I don't want you to take that as that's the letter grade they will earn, but it's conceptually the fact that Jordan, who spaces his learning into smaller sessions, is going to earn and have better mastery than Luke and Sally, who tend to condense or cram their sessions. And there's a lot of brain science research into this, and that students who will break up their sessions, not decrease the amount of hours, but break them up, can increase their performance upwards of 50% on a later test or measure of competence or mastery. And so the idea here on a brain science level is helping students understand that, yes, Sally, after 20 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour, based on how resilient she is in that study session, anything after that is just cycling through short-term memory, no matter what she's doing. It's going in one ear and out the other and not sticking, and she's wasting her time. Versus Jordan, who has these short spurts of study practice, the space between those is called the spaced learning. It's learning to forget. You'll hear that terminology if you dive into the literature. And that time between study sessions allows some minor forgetting to happen, which is a good thing for brain science, because when Jordan comes back to his next session, he has to reach back and really engage in that productive struggle to remember where he left off, remember what he covered, try to grapple with what he learned before. And that actual struggle will create stronger neuronal connections that improves his ability to access the information at a later date. So helping students learn how to space out their learning is really important. So I'm getting a question, would you say for asynchronous learning, breaking up the lectures into 15 or 20 minutes with a short activity in between is the way to go? Kelly, that is a great question. And there's research out there, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, face-to-face, doing what is termed chunkin checks, chunking the information in 15 minutes is kind of pushing it, but people have success with 15 minutes, and then giving a break of an activity, questions, switching gears, because beyond that, they're not going to be able to retain much information. And so regardless of your delivery platform, that's something that's a helpful technique. The other thing that I want to mention that you resonated for me, Kelly, is I always get a question of, okay, well, what is the spacing, right? So we see Lucas spaced it out and Jordan spaced it out. What's the ideal spacing between these sessions? How should I help my students? The research doesn't go as far as saying what is the desired amount of time between sessions. What it says is it needs to be far enough so a little bit of forgetting has happened, but not so far as that the information is not accessible anymore and not retrievable. And so there's some gray area there, conceptually knowing that we just don't want them to cram. The next slide here is talking about this idea of how to study versus not just rereading. And this is actually a slide I show my students on the first day of course when I do my course orientation and we set the container for learning, and I explain what it means when I go over how I expect them to navigate the learning process in my course. This comes from Rudiger and Karpicki, which it's a set of researchers in neurocognitive psychology and learning that are really the leading forethinkers in retrieval practice and spaced learning. And so and I'm going to broadly summarize the study. So if it interests you, I encourage you to go to the study and learn more about it. But on a broad level, they took 3 groups of students, and the first group, highlighted by this red bar here, were instructed just to reread a passage of content. Just reread it, reread it, reread it, reread it, up until the time they were tested on the knowledge. Their second group of students, marked by the green bar, were instructed to read several times passively and then engage in a session of active recall, which on here on this slide is called testing, but it's active recall practice, before they go to their official test, which is measuring their knowledge base. And then the third group of students, marked by that navy blue bar, was instructed, read once. I want you to read through these notes once and then stop, cut yourself off, and then the rest of your time up until your exam, engage in retrieval practice. What here on this slide is called testing. It's called the testing effect. So they're going to engage in retrieval practice over and over again up until the point they do their exam to measure mastery. And you'll see on this first set of bar graphs, the students in the group marked by the blue bar that read once and then engaged in retrieval practice outperformed the other groups that were more reliant on just this passive rereading, which is what we were all talking about through the chat box of students just passively reading the text. So here's the kicker, because this is where it's really important for us to explain to our students. The researchers then asked the students, okay, do you think this helped you? Like, was this an effective way to learn? And they gave the results to the students. They showed them their score on their final exam. So the students in the blue group that read once and then recalled and recalled and recalled saw that they performed really well. But yet when they were asked, did this help you? Did you learn? They still underestimated how well it helped them. And they were the lowest scoring group on the degree to which they thought strategies for learning worked. So what this tells us is it reinforces the idea that this active recall and active retrieval practice, and not just passively reading, is not innate to our learners. It doesn't feel natural to them. It actually makes them feel like they're struggling more because they don't recognize that the productive struggle is the learning process. And so as educators, I see part of our role is helping our learners understand that. And that's something that's important for them to know, because we can build that into the resources we share with them. And then the final concept I want to unpack before we put this into context is this idea of blocking versus interleaving. And so blocking and interleaving talks about how do we talk about and engage with our content material with our learners, and how do they engage with it outside of class. So an idea would be, in blocking, we talk all about topic A, we put a period after it, and then we move to topic B. So I'll give you my perspective from healthcare and use an example that I think most people can relate to. I think most people have heard about diabetes or high blood sugar. And so if I were teaching my students about diabetes or high blood sugar, I might block content like, okay, we're going to talk all about one type of diabetes called type 1. And now we're going to talk about all about another type of diabetes called type 2 diabetes. And guess what? Now we're going to talk about a third type, which is the type you get when you're pregnant. We're going to talk about gestational diabetes. This is how a lot of class structure is set up, with very delineated content over weeks, and students study that way. But brain science research tells us that if we are to interleave the topics and help them compare and contrast and discriminate nuances and differences between those topics, they actually build more clinical judgment skills and learn better. So what that might look like in my example is, all right, so we're going to talk about the dysregulation of blood glucose, and I want us to compare what are the symptoms that our patients have if they have type 1 versus type 2, versus if they have it while they're pregnant and they have gestational diabetes. Okay, so how are our care priorities and the way we treat these patients going to be different and similar across these different topics? And so that's an example within the nursing paradigm, how we might be able to interleave topics. And hopefully from your different disciplines, I'm seeing economics and psychology and geography and statistics, hopefully that will resonate with ways that you might be able to see discrete topics that you cover and have your students learn about. How might those be interleaved in a way that we can help build discriminatory skills? So where does that leave us? Great, we know brain science, we should be using it, we know the challenges that learners have. How do we pull all this together and help our learners? And so one way to do this, again, in an ocean of many ways, is changing our paradigm towards a paradigm of setting the table. So I mentioned to you earlier, a lot of times in education, we're worried about spoon feeding, right? And so one of the most powerful moments for me early on in my career, so I've been teaching about 13 years, one of the most powerful moments was a mentor telling me, you know, we tend to not want to spoon feed our students, that we shift the pendulum the opposite way and overcompensate and don't give them the scaffolding and the structure they need to be successful. And so a paradigm shift is, I'm not going to spoon feed you, but I'm going to set the table for learning. And so just as we would set a table for a meal for our guests to come to the table and engage with what we set on the table to feed themselves a meal, so too can we as educators set the learning table with resources and scaffolded learning resources, really, that learners can choose to come and engage in the cognitive lift of the learning meal. And so we can do that and set the table by the learning resources that we create for them in a way that doesn't spoon feed, but helps them be active constructors of their own knowledge and using brain science to do that. And so this is one way. There's always 100 ways to Walmart. So this is literally a drop in the ocean of ideas on what you can do to set up resources for your students. But I'm going to share with you one of the resources I've set up over the years that's been very helpful. It's called, I call it the Learning Guide, and it helps students navigate the learning process by using brain science techniques. And it's broken up as preview, review, synthesize. And it's actually a document. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. But the preview is what they do before class. How do they prepare? And rather than just saying prepare for class, I give them specific strategies they can use that are brain science based to help them get ready to come to class. Whether that class is synchronously online, asynchronously, or face-to-face. Then they attend class, and then they have the review section, which is typically, based on our conversation in the chat box earlier, what most of the students are doing the majority of their time doing, that passive rereading. Really, this review section should only be a third of their total study time. It's just to clear up the muddy points. They leave the lecture, or I shouldn't say lecture, it's actually a word I'm trying to remove from my lexicon of academic vocabulary. But they leave class time, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, and they still have muddy points. There's things that's still not clear to them. They use the textbook and learning resources there and reread to clear up those points, and then they're done. They move on to the synthesize section, which is where they spend the majority of their time engaging in active synthesis and application using those brain science concepts of retrieval practice and interleaving and elaboration. So I want to unpack these step by step and then give you an opportunity for thinking about how these concepts of brain science, maybe not in this learning guide process, but the essence of the brain science concepts might apply to your discipline and the courses in which you teach. So the preview section that I ask them to do before coming to class is really getting them primed for the content that they're going to encounter. And it also leverages the science that we know that they are not able to learn how to, or they're not able to know how to use a textbook effectively. So it helps them and provides a resource in how to use a textbook effectively. So how do they scan the assigned readings and focus on tables and figures? How do they review the chapter objectives and try the questions at the end? Because remember, brain science tells us priming and attempting questions before you have the knowledge and incorrect guessing actually potentiates learning. So I'll encourage my learners, go to the back of the chapter and try those questions before you actually dive into the content. Mapping out content headers and section titles. And then giving them an opportunity to answer key questions that will be introduced and reinforced during class, whether that's done through iReef asynchronously as an assignment, or Socrative, or Padlet, or there's a ton of different technologies. On Blackboard, quizzes, they're really just knowledge checks. Those are some strategies to think about. And then giving them an opportunity to build their metacognitive skills. So asking them the questions about, at this point before you come to class, what points are really clear and what are still muddy? What are things that you want to expand upon and unpack more? So at this point, I am going to ask Michelle to send you into small groups of about 4 to 5. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do for the next 6 or 7 minutes. We'll go with 7 minutes. I want you to think about what we've talked about with brain science techniques and think about how you might be able to apply them to previewing, how do you prepare your students for class? What are you currently doing, and what might you be able to incorporate within the context of the courses you teach? So at this point, I'll turn it over to Michelle. She'll send you out to your breakout. We'll spend about 7 minutes there, and we'll come back, and I'm going to invite each of you, a representative from each group, to share what you talked about. And I'm really going to challenge and invite you in this discussion with your small group to think beyond the preparation of read these chapters or read these pages. What can we do to help learners engage with the material before coming to class? Hopefully you had some rich discussion on reflections on what you currently do, ideas for how you might incorporate new practices into your preparation of students. If your conversation wandered into the review synthesize, just hold those thoughts, because we're going to get to that in just a second as we unpack. But I would invite members of the group who would like to speak as the Spirit moves them to share some of the thoughts that percolated while you were discussing in your small groups.
Yeah, so David, I'll be very quick. David, I'm in the business school. I teach international business, and I teach across all the different modalities at the moment. And so this is very helpful. Thank you. I would say that I've used this module learning approach on Blackboard, which is flexible between teaching modalities, and it also allows me to give students a lot of activities to work with each other and in advance of what we use our time in class to do, which is more active discussion, assessing much of the things they had been processing individually or in small groups prior to the class meeting. So I know that what I can do a lot more work on in terms of the size of my class is to, depending on the size of the class, is to have these briefer increments of active discussion with, some activities in between, which allows them to let things settle. So that may be the best I can give you, respective of where I got. But I can see it. I'm going to be able to gain a lot of value from this. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I'm curious to hear from others what popped up in your small group discussions.
So I was pretty happy. This is Suzanne. I'm from the College of Nursing. We had a really good discussion, I think, because we talked about the idea that because I work with Rachel and I benefit from that, we already do a preview kind of thing in our class, and we do it in class, and then they have online lectures. At the College of Nursing, we actually meet face-to-face right now. So we will preview the content in class, and then with the idea that students will leave, watch the chunked lectures with a direction. So that's what we do.
Love it. Thanks for sharing that, Suze. Other thoughts of folks that are burning to share what's on their mind?
My group mainly talked about the difficulty of getting, especially undergrad students, to engage with the materials before class, and that a lot of things, if it's not directly tied to the grade, that it won't get done, that it's just not important. And with my background in behavior analysis, I thought that might be a good opportunity to throw in some random reinforcement. So early in the course, you might choose an activity that is, kind of presented as optional and for learning, and then the people that participate in it might get some kind of bonus points for a test or something like that to encourage people to engage with those extra materials or to participate in office hours or things like that.
Kelly, I so appreciate you sharing this challenge of getting certain students to buy into this pre-work or this prep for class, specifically our undergraduate students, but we also see it in the graduate program a lot too. And I think one of the greatest challenges to make this effective and to make it work is you really have to kind of plant your stake in the ground and hold true to the expectation that this is the content and these are the activities you being the students need to do coming prepared to class. And a lot of times we try to give on that. When they come and they're not prepared, we'll sort of absorb that or accommodate and give them some information to be able to do the activities. And if we do that, it's just reinforcing the behavior and enabling the behavior that you don't actually have to do the pre-work before you come, because we're going to absorb that for you. And so it can be the first couple classes as you're creating the class norm, and really they're testing boundaries like they normally do as human nature, is to hold true to that. And so if they see that if they don't do the pre-work and then they come and they can't engage in the activities, the buy-in I have seen be most effective is them living that experience for the first 1 or 2 classes, and then they realize, oh man, she means this, and I actually really need to do it. And once they start to live it, they recognize how much helpful, how much more effective it is for their learning. So I totally resonate with that challenge, and it's an uncomfortable process until you can get them to buy in, and it requires us to really stay strong to our commitment and our teaching philosophy and our approach. So thanks for sharing that. I know we could probably go on for in the spirit of time and where we are. I would like us to move forward, and you'll have another opportunity to go back into your small groups to talk some more. But moving through at least the learning guide example I am sharing, this I don't expect you to be able to read the words on the screen. I'm going to show it to you in detail in a moment, but this is the 30-mile view of just the preview section that I give my students before class, which has the learning objectives. It gives them the resources and the videos to watch beforehand, and then gives them a readiness check. That's the priming aspect of brain science, where terminology that they've previewed that they're unfamiliar with, they need to define, answer some key concept questions that we're going to talk more about, and then give them an opportunity to engage in metacognitive practice of reflecting back on what are areas I think I get right now, and what are some areas that I really know I don't get, and the burning questions that I have. And I'll show that to you in detail so you can actually read it in a moment, but I just wanted to give you that 30-mile picture there. So they come to class, and then after they come to class, whether that's actually coming to class face-to-face or synchronously or asynchronously online, after class is the period where they review. This is what they think of as studying, but is not studying. It's using their text, their notes, to actively read and clear up the muddy points that are unclear. And then being able to access those learning materials in varied modalities, they really should be spending a third or less of their total time doing this. And this is where students tend to get stuck. They'll just spend more time because they feel like they're not ready. They feel like, I don't understand it, I need to keep reading it, I need to keep looking over the notes, and helping them understand you got to close the notes and close the book when you don't feel ready yet to start engaging in some of these synthesis activities. And so then the review section, again, you may not be able to read this, I'm going to show it to you in greater detail later, is just a segment that gives them resources for how to clear up muddy points. The specific points in the text, and in some classes it'll be videos that will unpack things that we've talked about either synchronously or asynchronously or face-to-face during class time. And then the final piece of this is what they're should be spending the most time on, which is the actual studying part, the active retrieval practice and the synthesis, and helping them space their learning to realize they should really begin this within 48 hours after they have the class session, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. And their activity should be focused on application and synthesis, where they're really leaning into the productive struggle of that desirable difficulty. Desirable difficulty is the term you'll see in the neuroscience of learning. And what that means is to engage that desirable difficulty, that productive struggle, they need to complete these activities without open resources, meaning close your notes, close your text, turn off Google, and try to really struggle with doing the exercise, whether it's working a math problem, or it's doing a concept map, or it's trying to answer a case study in business management, whatever it may be for your discipline. Concept mapping in nursing is a big one. Try and struggle with it. And I will also share with my students, and this is based on brain science also, struggle with it, and to the point where then you take a break, switch gears, go for a walk, go exercise, check your email, switch to a different subject, whatever it may be, and then come back to it. Try to struggle with it some more and see, you may have some holes you're able to plug in with some insights, because as you switch gears, your brain is still subconsciously percolating on this, another brain science term. And so then they're still going to have holes. There's still going to be things that they're not able to answer or fill out or complete in the activities that they're doing. Then they can open their notes, then they can open their resources and use what's called dual coding. This is brain science too. So if they were doing this on their computer, change their font color. If they're doing it with marker or a pen, change their pen color. And what they're filling in from their notes and their resources that weren't their own retrieval, they do in a different color. So that when they come back to that cognitive aid later, or that resource to review, that dual coding is going to help embed that information better and focus their attention in a metacognitive way on the areas that they need more reinforcement on. It helps them self-calibrate better. And so when I keep saying these activities, a lot of times educators are like, oh man, we are already strapped. I don't have time to make more activities or exercises for my students. And these activities don't have to be instructor created or instructor led, right? You can give them ideas, and I'll show you in a minute how to use resources that are already out there or create them themselves. So perhaps if you're teaching on a concept that are two related concepts that you're interleaving, they can create their own compare and contrast chart across different elements of that concept. I'll give you an example in healthcare, right? If we go back to that diabetes example, I may not have to create an activity for them, but I can say create a chart that lists the different types of diabetes across the columns, and on the rows it's the signs and symptoms and your complications that you're worried about and your interventions and X, Y, and Z, and they can start comparing and contrasting. And if learners are really hung on this self-testing, self-quizzing, if they do it that way, they can put little Post-it notes over those different cells of their compare and contrast table and use it as like a flip grid to test themselves. They're not using Quizlet, they've created it themselves, and they've really engaged in the work of learning then. Other concepts that you can incorporate into the synthesized phase of studying is the idea of interleaving, which we've talked about, which is the comparing and contrasting, the differentiating, which is the example I gave with the table that they could create. Elaboration, which is the idea of they're giving the material new meaning by connecting it to their prior knowledge or connecting it to what they already understand. So things like concept mapping or giving them what if scenarios. So we talked about this. What if this changed? How would your thinking or your prioritizing or your answer change? For those who are very auditory and verbal, teaching others and doing scenarios where they're having to explain things to others who are outside that field or discipline can be very effective. Generation is another concept that I did not put on the slide, but is applicable to this phase of studying. And for those who are not familiar with the term generation in brain science, generation is the idea of attempting to answer or solve the problem before they've really given all the information to be able to do it. And so that might be giving them a case study before you've actually talked about it fully to get them to try to answer it. It's experiential learning. And then creating opportunities for them to engage in retrieval practice. And so retrieval practice doesn't always have to be the quizzing that they do through Blackboard or through another quizzing system. It could be recreating tables and charts from memory with their resources closed. It can be free recall, the brain dump, the 1-minute paper. Those count as retrieval practice, and there's a lot of research coming out that really shows those types of activities count as retrieval practice when it's done from memory, and they're just as effective. So with that, I want to show you, again, you're not going to be able to read this, and I'm going to show it to you closer up in a minute. This is what the synthesis section of my learning guide would look like for my students, and it gives them ideas for activities that can be completed individually or in a group that hit on a lot of those brain science principles. And I'm going to show you that example in greater detail in a minute. So with that, we go to small groups. I want to pull up the learning guides for you, and then I'm going to send you out into your small groups. So this is one example of a learning guide, and on your screen you can change your zoom to see it better. But this would be the preview section of setting up the learning objectives for them, their resources to prepare before class and engage in metacognitive thinking, and then what they do immediately after class to clear up muddy points, and then some of the activities that they might be able to do in the synthesis section of the learning process. I'm going to switch to a different example now. It looks pretty similar, but this is an example I do for my graduate students. So it looks pretty similar on the preview section of how they prepare, exploring a certain resource and reading and doing some certain modules through our vendor ATI. But you'll notice that my synthesis section looks a little different. It doesn't have the very specific concrete activity examples for my graduate students. It gives them some tips and some guidance on how to leverage brain science, and then ideas for creating retrieval practice activities and synthesis opportunities for them. And I'm happy to share these in detail in PDF for those who want to see them outside of the session. But at this point, I would like to turn it over to Michelle for about 5 minutes in small groups to think about, we've now talked about review and synthesize. In your small groups, think about what are some of the brain science techniques that you could incorporate in your course for students to do outside of class time, after class, to solidify their learning, to engage in some of those brain science techniques. Just as before, I would just like to open the floor and invite those who had conversations in their small group to share some of the thoughts, ideas, points, and perspectives that came up in discussion. That we have a wonderful learning community in nursing. I would agree. I think there's lots of other disciplines that have wonderful learning communities, which is why I'm so grateful that the CTE creates opportunities for us to collaborate and network like this. Other thoughts, I would invite folks who would like to unmute their mic and share some of the insights, ideas, or thoughts, or maybe what you're realizing you're already doing. A lot of times we're doing much of this, we just don't realize we're doing it, or the brain science that informs it. So floor is yours.
Yes.
In our group, we were talking a lot about how we all really agree that these strategies are really good and would help improve our students' understanding and learning. And we were kind of wrestling with trying to understand students' motivation to actually want to do work, that's kind of this extra work, if you will. So we were wrestling with the idea of, like, you know, how might we assign grades or extra credit or something for students completing this kind of metacognitive work. We also were thinking about it from kind of like a practical, like, grading and time aspect of, like, you know, if you decided to collect these assignments and grade them, how much time might that take? So we were just thinking kind of some of the logistics and motivation, and would be happy to hear, like, what your thoughts are about how to motivate students, especially if they were like a Carolina Core student, to really dive deep into thinking about how they are learning in your class.
I love the conversation your group had. You're thinking about this and really wrestling with it, and I think that's wonderful. And it's things that we wrestle with too a lot in my group of folks who are really engaged in metacognitive-based teaching and learning. So the first thing I will say to you to make this effective is you have to be very transparent with your pedagogical decisions in the design of your course. And with that, I mean, you have to share, why are we doing the things we're doing? Why am I asking you to do these things, and why are we setting up the expectations the way we are? And linking it with the science of how they learn and the outcome improvement that they'll see has been really effective, and it's powerful. And so sometimes students will buy into that right away. And a lot of times students will be like, that's great, but I'm doing it my way. And I'll give you an example. This semester, we launched a new master's level entry to nursing practice program. So I have graduate students that are coming in with a bachelor's in anything other than nursing. And some of them have jumped onto this new way of learning. It's very different for them to engage in these activities outside of class. And others have not. And it took until the first exam. Like, I really had to be true to my teaching philosophy and belief that learning based on brain-based science is effective. And so it took them, really, some of them, to the first exam to see their score. And then we had a conversation in a huddle to really talk about over the course of the previous years, we've used metacognition and brain-based science teaching. Those who engage in it tend to see better learning outcomes than those who don't. And here's how you might be able to adjust your learning. So being transparent in the decisions, the pedagogy, and the why of why we're doing this. The other thing too is, you know, I'm speaking from experience, not the science. I'm not aware of any research out there that uses a points-based system or a grading system to entice or motivate students to engage in metacognitive behaviors. Most of the research is really about teaching students this is the way to learn that's effective. And so just like before, your way to learn was rereading and rereading passively a book, this new way of learning that is really based in science is the way to do it. And so the score that they see is the one that they earn on their exam. And so those activities that they do, creating the charts or creating the case studies, is really their studying that becomes their cognitive aid to prepare for exams. rather than a grade-based activity. Now, not to say that you couldn't design deliverables and outcomes in your course, but remember, when we do that, we want them to align with the learning objectives. So your deliverables and evaluation methodology could absolutely be based in brain science, but for the sort of the focus of the studying, they can do those activities on their own as well. Suze, you have a thought or a question to add?
I have a thought because, again, this is something that we struggle with, and we tell our students, we just remind them probably every other class that doing the pre-class activities is what's going to help them be prepared for learn, but they won't see that outcome until they take the exam. And even with the undergrads, upper division undergrads, these are juniors and seniors. It boggles my mind sometimes that they treat each nursing class like it's something brand freaking new and wait until after the first exam to see how they should study. And we all give the tests the same way. They're all, application or above type questions, and not based on PowerPoint slides or based on is synthesis of information, but they always wait. So we tell them, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. And then we do have people who repeat, and they come back and they see us the second time, and we're saying, well, are you doing this? And they're not. They start doing it, and all of a sudden they do great. Why didn't I do this last semester?
Yeah, part of it is living it out and them seeing that it works and hearing from their peers. Sometimes the feedback from their peers can be stronger than anything we tell them. Kelly brought up a really important question in the chat, which said, would this be good as part of your introduction syllabus first day talk? Yes, yes, yes. Like, I cannot put enough exclamation marks behind that, Kelly, and I appreciate you raising that. I am very explicit about sharing my teaching philosophy with my learners when I set the container on the very first day of the course. And so part of that is explaining the way the course is set up, the pedagogical decisions that I make to help them and facilitate their learning, and why that's important. And so ever since I started doing that many years ago, that little ounce of prevention has been worth a pound of cure of trying to, drag people, it's the carrot versus the stick. And so I would really encourage folks, I'm a big proponent of being clear on your own teaching philosophy, not for the purpose of your T&P, tenure and promotion packet, but your lived teaching philosophy. What is it that you see and that you value, and how you structure your learning space and hold your learning space for your learners? We'll talk about making thinking visible. I talk about holding learners in high regard while holding them to high standards. So I share my philosophy with them and tell them how that impacts them and how the science drives navigating the learning process in the course. So how do you respond to students who say you didn't teach us how to do this when you haven't gone over a problem that it's exactly like the one they're practicing, but that they would be able to do if they had internalized the material? Oh, that's a good question, Jessica. Well, so I think part of this is, if I understand your question correctly, if you're having them do elaboration or generation techniques, so they're trying to tackle, or priming, where they're trying to tackle questions or case studies before they've engaged with the material, I frame it up that way, and I tell them, I acknowledge it and say, look, you're going to be tackled with these questions because you're flexing thinking muscles you haven't flexed yet on content that we're going to dive deeper into. And this is going to help potentiate your learning. It's going to plant the seeds so that when you do these activities beforehand and then you come to class and we talk about it and we engage in it more, you're going to get better traction. So the idea is that you don't have these activities and you never revisit them. The idea is that they do these activities to prime their thinking, to start planting and starting to connect the neuronal networks, and then their time with you, whether synchronously, asynchronously, face-to-face, is helping solidify their thinking, making thinking visible, so that you're not spending your time talking at them during your class time together. You're spending your time facilitating their thinking and facilitating their learning. I hope that helps. When it's framed up like that, typically students won't come at, you didn't teach us this, because we close the loop and dive deeper into it later. Would mock exams help? So any type of quizzing, any type of testing, any type of opportunity to engage in retrieval practice is really helpful. I actually create, and this is not just me, it's across our nursing program as a whole. We've agreed to this as section of faculty, that we do online knowledge checks. So we don't call them quizzes because we reframe the paradigm of their approach, right? So this is not about doing a quiz online and being tempted to control F your way through a PowerPoint to answer the questions. We give them multiple attempts at an online knowledge check where the first attempt we say treat it like a test and close your resources and be able to self-calibrate your learning. It gives them feedback not on their answers, but the questions they missed without giving them the right answers or the wrong answers. So they know the content areas. It helps with self-calibration. So they can go back and then study the content some more and come back for a second attempt and retry it again. And so there's actually a really great article, and it's not on the reference list, but I will add it to a reference list if folks are interested, that really looked at the effectiveness of creating these pre-class priming quizzes as a way of gauging knowledge, self-calibration, and enticing them to be prepared for class. So I'd be happy to share that. Knowledge checks, yes, what we call it is knowledge checks. Some call it knowledge challenges. There's all sorts of fun ways to re-paradigm the connotation around the word quiz. I want to thank you all for attending and being engaged in the small group discussions. I hope that this piques your interest in brain science, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you.